Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and host of the 35 West podcast.
Was how professional the Mexican government.
Are we ready? I don't think.
Reform trends in Argentina.
Right. And that's what happened.
Role at all in the NAFTA negotiations.
Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and co-host of the 35 West podcast. Space has long been colored by divides between the haves who possess the economic and technological wherewithal to make it to orbit and beyond, and the have-nots who lack these capabilities. This divide, in turn, has historically played out between the global north and the global south, with the latter grouping feeling as if they have been excluded from sharing in the benefits of space exploration. However, this is only part of the picture. As space becomes an increasingly critical and sensitive issue, its exploration, development, and governance will be of great importance for all countries. In Latin America, the conversation around space is especially dynamic, with countries across the region cultivating their domestic industries and pursuing a host of international partnerships. At the same time, the rising prominence of outer space has provoked fears that China is expanding its space footprint in the Western Hemisphere at the United States' expense. While such concerns raise alarms in Washington, a more nuanced understanding of how key countries in Latin America view space is often lacking. To help us unpack these dynamics, we are honored to be joined today by Laura Delgado Lopez, visiting fellow with the Americas Program. Laura has been a policy analyst for nearly 15 years in Washington, D.C., working in leading space organizations like the Secure World Foundation. Today, we will delve into the ways in which Latin American countries converge and diverge in their approach to space cooperation, which forms the subject of Laura's forthcoming report, Orbital Dynamics, the Domestic and Foreign Policy Forces Shaping Latin American Engagement in Space. Laura, welcome back to the 35 West podcast.
Thank you, Ryan. Excited to be here.
Laura, this report serves as the culmination of a year's worth of research for you at CSIS, funded by the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, including several visits to the region and fieldwork, interviews you've done with experts. I'd like you to begin by sketching a scene setter for our 35 West podcast audience. What inspired you to take on this issue, and why is it important for us to understand regional perspectives on space?
Sure. So for me, this is kind of a joyous revisiting of a set of questions that I first had when I was a graduate student at George Washington University Space Policy Institute. At the time, some of the headlines that were really jumping out at me were, for example, China launching Simón Bolívar, which was Venezuela's first satellite, and also plans to do the same with other countries like Bolivia. And it seemed, obvious to just think about it in terms of ideological alignment. But I had a lot more questions about what else were these countries up to, what about other countries? And it was really hard to find information about that. Everything seemed to be focused on the U.S.-China rivalry. And so while that's an important trend and an important dialogue to have, again, it didn't really answer any questions about the why or the how of these country space programs. And so as part of my research as a graduate student, I did a paper focused on Chinese Latin American Space Cooperation, trying to delve into that a little bit more deeply. For our IR geeks out there, I used Robert Putnam's analogy of board games to look at both domestic and foreign policy aspects. And that was 2012, and then continued my career in space and really always meant to go back to that. And a lot has happened since then. And I also had a lot of questions of things that maybe were announced back then that did they even happen, right? And other developments involving other countries, involving the private sector, involving universities. And so I was really just incredibly fortunate to be awarded this fellowship by CFR and by your program for taking me in to host me while I do this research. And so in one sense, this is a story of me just answering questions that I was just really interested in. But as I hopefully have convinced you by now, this also matters from two perspectives. For the space community, there's a lot of challenges that we're thinking about how to answer in a collective way. And that's just a function of how space activities are, right? It's almost impossible. I'm trying to think of a scenario where one space actor could just set a norm and execute it and not need at least part of the world to go along with that. And so that necessitates international engagement. It has necessitated it from the very beginning. So from that sense, understanding the ins and outs of different countries is important for space advocates and analysts. But also for Latin Americanists, I now understand more the issues you all track every single day and that wake you up at night. And the truth is space has a role in many of them. And so my hope is that, obviously, this research is as narrow as I could do in just 1 year, and there's a whole world out there, but hopefully it starts to bridge some of these conversations.
We covered this briefly in the introduction, but far from comprehensively. Everywhere you look today, it seems the idea of the global south and its rising geopolitical sway permeates all discussions of international relations. Laura, how useful is it, the framework of the North-South divide, in understanding Latin America's approach to space activities? Are there other forces at play in explaining the diverging approaches we see countries taking in the region?
It's pretty limited. One of the challenges it has is it's pretty static. You either put a country on one category or on the other. And so it's not helpful to understand other dynamics. It also ignores things like regional politics or domestic constraints, right? And so some of the approaches that I found more useful, one is a more relational dynamic, and that's looking at Tom Long's book, A Small State's Guide to Influence in World Politics, that I found really excellent. And so even through the lens of space, we look at a country like Brazil, and it's going to be the large power in a relationship with a more emerging country in terms of space capabilities, but it's going to be the small power in a relationship with a different country. And so I found that much more fluid and much more useful in that standpoint. But then also thinking about domestic constraints. Another book that I found really useful was Seeking the Bomb by Vipin Narang. And that's focused on nuclear weaponization. But again, I thought it was really helpful from thinking about, a country just one day waking up deciding we're going to have a space program or we're going to have a satellite doesn't necessarily mean they actually execute it or get there. And so some of the constraints that are at play there have to do with institutions, legal frameworks, all that good stuff. I do think countries in the global south in space issues do sometimes take positions from that standpoint and viewpoint. So I don't want to completely throw it out of the window. For example, in the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the G77 will often make statements as a bloc. So that is useful, but it has limited predictive capabilities. And so if you'll recall my very first piece here at CSIS, I talked about the BRICS alliance as a potential avenue for alignment on space issues, which I think has certainly proven out in the last few months. So again, it's a little bit more complex. I don't think Brazil is always going to side with China and Russia just because it's a member of that. So I think, again, don't throw it out the window, but it is not as useful when you try to think about where these countries are actually coming from.
Thanks, Laura. And for listeners who are interested in reading the piece that Laura just referenced, it had a brilliant title. It was called BRICS from Above. How is the United States historically engaged with Latin American countries on space? Are there any particular regional grievances or pain points the U.S. must navigate in its engagement with the rest of the hemisphere?
In a couple of words, I would say it's been sporadic and pretty limited. In the early history, there were initial collaborations tied to the space shuttle program and to placing ground stations in the region so they could track shuttle flights and satellites and that kind of thing. There has been some extensive collaboration on the scientific side. So, for example, Argentina and NASA collaborated on a mission to study the ocean salinity called Aquarius. That was launched in 2011. Perhaps one of the most recent examples was NASA, again, scientific collaboration with Brazil in a small mission called SPORT to study solar activity. And that was in 2022. And so there certainly have been specific projects, but there's another layer of rich technical exchange, again, in the more scientific sphere, operational sphere. But it's not very visible, and it's not anything that you see as building towards something. It's not like strategic in that standpoint. And so I think that's been one of the frustrations where it just feels very tactical. And honestly, it kind of mirrors U.S. engagement in other issues, right? And so one quote I use a lot that I find really useful, and I use in the report, Dr. Scott Pace, the director of the Space Policy Institute at GW, says space is a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator when it comes to international relations. So in that sense, you see in space some of the same dynamics you see in the relationship more broadly. And again, it's just not very visible. So someone might tell me, yes, we've signed all these things and we've done A, B, C, or D, and I don't want to question that, but it's not as visible as some of the other partnerships that you see in the region. In terms of grievances, it all comes back, I think, some exist, and they come back to, 70s, 80s, and the advent of the missile technology control regime, export control rules. And so some countries like Brazil and Argentina were particularly burned by that. And so always think of space. Space is inherently strategic. It's inherently dual use. So of course it's going to have strategic implications. And so there's always this tension between competition and cooperation. And I think some of the countries in the region feel that the US was leaning in one direction more than the other.
Let's go to some of the findings in your report. One of the case studies in that piece is that of Brazil and Argentina. And you've just brought up Brazil and Argentina in your previous answer. Have you observed recent frictions between Milei and Lula permeating their ongoing space cooperation efforts as well?
So not yet. You're referring to Sabia Mar, which is a fascinating story that I'm really thrilled I got to write about. So this dates back decades, and it's a collaboration to put together satellite missions to study the oceans, which is obviously a shared interest of both countries. And there's been strong collaboration at the technical level, but it's been this political alignment, this kind of ebb and flow between the leaders that has spurred it, and I worry might delay it a little bit further, just looking at the relationship between the leaders right now. Again, like I said, space is not a leading indicator, so I don't think it's necessarily going to be escalated to the level of the precedents. But if the current spat that they're having continues, space is going to be one of the things I think that could be caught in that mix. And so when you think about how complex these projects are, and any delay or any technical problem can lead to the need for, say, new resources and accelerating efforts. And if the leaders have such a visible kind of tension and conflict, it seems difficult to really argue for the political capital that you might need to continue supporting an effort like that. Now, I'm hopeful and I hope it continues because I think it's a great story, but it is one to watch from that standpoint.
Part of the growing interest in space from the global south and the north alike is that space as a whole has become absolutely fundamental for countries' national security, economic growth, climate adaptation, countless other practical applications, as you've taught us very well over the last year with the CSIS Americas program. In your opinion, what are the most important things that Latin American countries are looking to get from their investments in the space sector? How do these objectives differ across the region?
I've always found rationales, the why behind space activities really interesting, because as I started learning about space, I saw a contrast between the whys of a country like the United States and the whys of newer actors, some in Europe and definitely those in the region. In the region, you see a strong emphasis on societal benefits. So the type of applications that you highlighted are the reasons why these countries are investing in space. In Portuguese, they call it the transversalidade. So this idea that space kind of is a cross-cutting thing and that can sort of boost and augment economic and other types of policies in other areas. It helps justify the investment on one standpoint, but it's also because, again, it's not space for space's sake. It's not space to reap just prestige. It's more about the benefits. And so what I find really instructive is that one of the countries that several in the region cite as a model is India. They talk about India and they say, look at where India was 20, 30 years ago. That is where we may find ourselves today, and where we want to go is where they are today. So India has a very reliable, very successful launch program. It has satellite projects across the gamut and has really made space part of their national development and prestige. So it's not necessarily that that's not there. That's just not the driving feature. So in terms of some differences, and that's why I think it's so useful to really root this analysis and understanding where these countries are coming from. Brazil, of course, has global projections, as they do in almost every other issue. So Brazil, their space program will contain some of those more prestige-oriented goals. But again, when you read their statements and when you talk to experts, they really begin with this link to societal benefits.
I want to ask you a question about what some of the main barriers are. Is access to technology the main hurdle? Is this still about haves and have-nots, as I framed it in my introduction? What more is needed?
I think we've shifted away from that because technology has become way more accessible. There's a trend we talk about in space called the democratization of space. And so it's now no longer a case of one country, in this case, let's say the United States, preventing others from accessing that technology. That's just not the case. There's so many resources out there, including in the commercial sector. So there are avenues for that. There's also a lot of resources that are freely available. And in that, the U.S. has been a leader, for example, in openly sharing scientific data collected from our satellites, right? Brazil has done the same. And so it's almost, from that standpoint, is a very different dynamic. You have access. But as you start understanding when you look at some of these issues, actually using the information to improve decisions is a very complex process. And here's where there's a challenge that is not just unique to the region. It's actually, I think, a challenge my community struggles with. Is sometimes we talk about space in such an isolated fashion. We focus on the technology, we focus on the operation of the things, that then it's hard to step back and build the bridges that need to exist for those technologies to actually be useful. I'm talking laws, policies, institutional frameworks, really boring stuff that I love. And so when I look at some of the space programs in the region, I see that some of the challenges aren't so much in access to the technology, but in these gaps, in building these bridges. And so lately I've been arguing that rather than just focus on just developing the tools, and again, we can always do more and better with that, especially, for example, in situations of crisis and emergencies. But governance is one area that's really lacking and that could really benefit, I think, from international cooperation and from looking at models of how other countries are facing some of these challenges.
We're many minutes into this podcast and we haven't yet talked about China and Russia, so it's time for a question about great power competition, which has really always been part of space. It's always featured great power competition, but I think the link for countries is becoming far sharper as both Russia and China expand their offensive space capabilities in specific. What role has Latin America played, or what role could it play in reinforcing these norms in the governance treaties and the governance of space, particularly around the peaceful use of outer space?
One of the parts of the report that I was really excited to write was a bit of the history, again, not so much on the sense of the technology, but on this point that you raise, is the role that Latin America has always played in the development of norms and rules regarding the use of space. And that's really, really fascinating because countries like Mexico, Brazil, Argentina were among the members who first participated in the Committee of the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which I mentioned earlier. That's where all the foundational space treaties were developed back in the 60s and 80s. These countries were active even then, right? And many, many others as well. And so here's a region that delegations have been very active in these forums. They are very educated and engaged on the topics of the day that pertain to, some of the novel uses of space and some of the questions we have about, for example, using resources on the moon and in asteroids and in other locations around the solar system. Countries like Chile drawing on its expertise in mining, etc. There's subject matter experts. There's rich scholarship in Spanish and in Portuguese that I think some of the English analysts, unfortunately, are just not aware of. So there's a strong foundation. Now, what I think the opportunity is that given the strong kind of alignment around principles and values, peaceful use of space is a value that's really important in the region, really thinking about, as a region, what does it mean to implement these principles, I think will be really exciting and really valuable to advance the global conversation. And some of the recent pieces, for example, the one I wrote on Peru joining the Artemis Accords, I highlight that it's unique with some of the signatories of the Accords that countries like Peru, their space agency, the National Space Agency, is in the Ministry of Defense. And so what does it look like for them to implement a principle like sharing of scientific data, as I mentioned earlier, when a system that they operate, like Perusat, is going to meet both civil and defense needs? So it's not going to be as simple as just saying, what was the data collected for? No, the data may have been collected for both types of uses, right? So I don't think that's a problem. I don't think that's an obstacle. I think it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for a country like Peru to say, hey, Colombia, Chile, et cetera, countries that are either signatories now or maybe in the future, or that haven't joined that effort but have alignment on similar principles, what does it look like for us to actually implement them? And I think it's an opportunity for leadership.
I want to shift our conversation now to a discussion of U.S. partnerships with countries in the region. One thing that we've seen in U.S. rhetoric over the past decade or so is an increasing focus on China. I think the conversation, particularly on space as well, has become tinged by great power competition, especially as China's footprint in the regional space sector has grown. How should we make sense of the actions by countries like Brazil, which has pursued cooperation with both China on satellite development while also signing on to the U.S.-led Artemis Accords?
I think you can call it active non-alignment, hedging. Universality is another term I've read when it comes to space. Whatever term you use, I think Brazil wants to be able to decide who to partner with and keep the door open. That's just something they value, right? It's a way for Brazil to show it's a global player. And I think you can debate it as much as you can any of its stances on other issues, right? Whether that's right or wrong, or whether it's, executing it correctly. But when you look at history and even what led to that initial collaboration with China, it was both a technical need in the United States. The United States was exploring commercializing the Landsat program, which at the time Brazil was using data from that system to study its territory. So Brazil was concerned that maybe they were not going to have access to that data anymore, wanted to develop that technology. But like I said before, at that time was also all of the missile non-proliferation policies and just a lot of tension around that. And so they found China, and they found a willing partner in China. And they were able to establish a partnership that, in their own words, was a win-win partnership, where each side would learn. Brazil had a lot of experience in knowing how to study and analyze imagery of the Earth, and China had some technical experience that was useful. And over time, they got to parity in terms of their roles. And in fact, they share operation of the satellites. Sometimes China operates, sometimes Brazil operates. And I think in a way, it's that longevity of that relationship, that stability, that means it will continue. But as you point out, it doesn't mean Brazil isn't going to partner with the United States. It's just going to do that in other areas. And I think the risk is trying to approach it from a one or the other standpoint, because I don't think there's enough of a promise there to say, oh, we're going to have an equally long, productive, expansive relationship with you, right? And so I just don't see the incentive for a country like Brazil to then suddenly shut the door on this long-standing partnership. I think, the reality is they're going to keep, like I said, all avenues open.
So when it comes to what makes the ideal partner for a country in Latin America, a partnership on space, how does the United States better meet our Latin American friends and partners on their terms, given what you've learned over the year with us?
I think this is one case where, again, treating space as unique is not helpful. It's more about see what countries in the region are clamoring for in partnerships in other areas, right? There's pushback against paternalistic approaches or ones that emphasize just alignment on values but have little substance. They want to be treated as equals. Same with space. And so I think that's particularly compelling today when, again, these countries have capabilities, have expertise, have skilled workforce, and they have real needs that they want to meet. And they have willing partners who are ready to offer that, right? And so I think it's a different relationship, different asymmetry than maybe it was in the very beginning. So how does the U.S. better engage? I think first we listen. We take a comprehensive approach. And, I write in the piece a lot about, given some of the somewhat fractured nature of the space communities in these countries, it doesn't help for us to send General Richardson off on one angle and then have Secretary of State Blinken in another and then NASA in another. I think we need to be better coordinated. And finally, we strive to work longer term relationships, right? Where space is a part of that. Space is not a leading indicator again, but it's part of the mix. It needs to be rooted in the broader relationship, I believe.
Laura, you've clearly been reading a lot and researching a lot over the course of your year with CSIS Americas. There were references in this podcast to Robert Putnam, Tom Long's book on small states and influence in the international system. I think there was a Vipin Narang reference as well on Seeking the Bomb. Clearly, you've had a very robust reading list. Is there something else from your research with us that you would like to highlight or add on this podcast?
So just two quick things. One is a topic that I didn't have a chance to really delve into, but that we started to, right, in the event that I was fortunate to be able to host here at CSIS with the Space Enterprise Council on business-to-business engagement. I think the business side of the developments in Latin America is fascinating. I think the fact that it's almost occurring independent of some of these governance conversations, given all the politics in the region, is pretty unique when you look at developments in other regions. So I think that's a story that just needs a lot more attention, maybe another year of my life. So one to watch for sure. The other one is that when I talk about these topics and I get the question of what's the so what for the United States, again, I think when I put my U.S. analyst hat on, we have economic, political, cultural, social interests that are just inextricably linked to the region. And space is part of some of that in a really strong way. Climate change, national security, some of the things we talked about here. And so I think it's really in our benefit to really just understand the region better from the standpoint of what it is they're doing in space and how. And I think it could open some doors for opportunities for us. And yes, not just from the standpoint of perhaps winning that battle against China, but also just to put space in a landscape where we're building closer relationships with countries in the region.
Laura, thanks so much for spending a year with us on your CFR International Affairs Fellowship. You could have gone many other places, but you decided to be with us at CSIS. So thanks for letting us learn from you over the past year and educating us on these issues of extreme importance for the region. And thank you for joining 35 West. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.
For you, thank you for joining. Stay tuned for the next episode of 35 West.